Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second short webinar in our new series, Can Cycling and Micromobility Deliver a Modern and Sustainable City? My name is Jérémie Hayden-Lefebvre, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Green Mobility magazine. These sessions are part of a wider initiative and a forthcoming book by Giles Bailey, which examines how cycling and micromobility can help cities become more sustainable, livable, and economically resilient. The book draws on over a decade of insights from across Europe and beyond, exploring how policy, investment, innovation are transforming the way we move and experience our cities. At the Green Mobility magazine, we cover the broader policy context behind these developments, from urban planning to clean transportation to industrial strategy and the energy transition. And this collaboration between Giles and the Green Mobility magazine continues that mission, extending the conversation beyond the printed page. The purpose of these webinars is to take some of the issues raised in the book and explore them in a concise and accessible way. Each session focuses on a specific theme, and today we will be discussing the particularly important one, data in micromobility. Our goal is to share perspectives, stimulate discussions, and we invite you to take part in this wider journey. From time to time, we might also step beyond the themes in the book to address related questions, shaping the broader mobility and cycling agenda. With that brief introduction, I'd very much like to hand over to Giles and Raphael to introduce themselves and today's topic in greater detail.
Thank you, Thomas. And again, I'm Giles Bailey, a consultant, lecturer, and writer based in London in the UK, and I'll also be joined by my colleague, Raphael Cavalcanti from Germany, for this webinar. Over the next 15 minutes, we'll explore briefly some of the issues of data needs for cycling and micromobility. The topic is huge, and there's so many issues and aspects and subtleties that we could talk about. So we're going to just focus in on a few items this morning in this webinar. And so to start off, how many people are actually cycling? And in a sense, why is this so hard to determine? And I'll pass to Raphael to give his initial thoughts.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Raphael, based in Mainz in Germany here to help, let's say, feed some of the conversation and some of the thought into this. So to address your initial question, Giles, how many people are cycling? Depends who asks. And I think that's the right way to start it off, because theoretically we can say billions of people are cycling. Half of maybe 5 billion people, 6 billion people, depending on how you count it. Whether they're unique people who use a bicycle once a year or people who use a bicycle every day. And that's where we start getting into sort of the challenges. How do we define what is cycling use? How do we actually measure it? And in what areas of the world do we measure it? In what areas of the world do we actually measure it very well or very poorly? And this shows how complex data gathering is in this environment, because bicycles are such a flexible form of transportation that they can be used for anything, either just going to a park or being used as a main form of transportation for an entire family. And I think that's where the real challenge is for policymakers, is they have to focus on one or two very discrete things, while the world of cycling is extremely broad and very, very dynamic as well, I would say.
And Thomas, how would you add to this debate?
I think it's invariably challenging to analyze and assess how many people cycle, from the mere fact that most bikes aren't connected in any way, and most cycle paths themselves, from my understanding, I'm sure you gentlemen know more than I do, don't necessarily have the telematics data available like roads do. Today we have ANPR systems, we have smart road systems. I'm not too sure that cycling is probably encompassed in that. That being said, if we look at Europe, population of about 300, 400 million people, there's countries such as the Netherlands and Denmark where commuting by bike is common. So if we take those countries, we can extrapolate how many people cycle. That being said, it's more of an art than a science at this stage, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that poses a number of challenges for planning and policies, as I'm sure we'll discuss.
Absolutely, and I would add that, as both of you said, cycling is very pervasive and instantaneous. It's in some ways a very simple mode. And in the book, we talk about there are over 1 billion cycles in the world. And the vast majority of cycling is done by personal cycling. So obviously the shared schemes that we see in cities all over the world are very exciting and new, but we must remember the vast majority of cycling is someone who just owns their own bike, and they're not in the city center. They're in local communities, going to local schools, going to local jobs. They are just everywhere using their bikes. And I think a lot of the focus can be on those city centers and those showcases and along the river and the big park. And people view that cycling and think that is really the cycling we need to count. And in a sense, it isn't. Well, it's great to do it, but it isn't. It's that personal cycling. And I think one of the conundrums, I think, as Raphael has mentioned, is there is no need for a personal cyclist to data enable their device or their bike, really, because why should they? They get on the bike, go where they're going. So it's often very hard to actually capture that trip, whether it's to school or to the local shops or to your job, and not capturing that data because it's not necessarily data enabled. And yes, we have fitness apps and so on, but that's always going to be a minority. Makes counting cycling quite hard. I think to move on, I'd like to ask again, to the panel, what is your view of the key metric that cities should be considering, particularly for strategies, planning, decision making? What should they be measuring? And let's go in reverse order. So Thomas, you start.
I think from my perspective, it should be about the number of cyclists, but also the location of the cyclists. I have no doubt that when we look at how cyclists use and engage, with the city, it's not homogeneous across that city. There's going to be areas where you're going to, like cars, right, where you're going to have a lot of through flow traffic, where you're going to have a large percentage of cyclists. I think understanding the number and the intensity of cycling on a specific road or series of roads is probably the most important aspect for an urban planner, at least in larger cities. When it comes to smaller towns and communities, there I think it's more about understanding where the traffic goes. So where are people trying to get to, from which region in the region, from what part in the region are they trying to go from, and where are they going to? If it is, for example, from, let's say, a small outskirt to a hospital for medical appointments, I think facilitating that trip by bicycle is great, is a priority. Same thing with schools. Same thing with other public services or even business parks.
And Raphael?
So I'll take one of Thomas's actual parameters or metrics, cycling intensity, which I would like to differentiate from the modal split, because it's essentially a thing. How many people are cycling in this square kilometer or this square acre or whatever surface area measurement we'd like to use on a frequent basis, independent of what they're using it for, whether they're commuting, whether they're just doing it for leisure, or going from point A to point B, going to a doctor's appointment. So that is, I think, an important metric. Another thing that should definitely be looked at, and it's less on the cycling side, but it's also the replaceability, the mode replaceability. So it's looking at what movements do not take place today with a bicycle or micromobility that could easily be replaced without any penalty in terms of cost and time to people. So that is something that is at least a tool which requires at least 2 levels or even 3 levels of analysis from the policymakers, but it allows them to understand what levers should I put into play so that I can remove a bit more of, let's say, the heavy traffic, which is a nuisance to a lot of people, or maybe to everyone, and then incite more people to move towards micromobility. And then lastly, one of the things that I thought is an interesting topic, which is starting to be discussed in the academic world, is the concept of minimum mobility. In a specific part of a city, what are the key elements that you need to provide a minimum of, let's say, call it decent mobility for people in that area? In some areas, it might be, okay, we just need better roads. Okay, that also comes along with better cycling infrastructure. So in summary, I think cycling intensity, the replaceability of other modes by micromobility, and the minimum mobility metric, which gives you an understanding of what movements are taking place and what needs to be in place for people to actually have what is considered to be modern, decent mobility.
Thank you. And in a sense, I would actually almost take it back to a more wouldn't say basic, but more straightforward metric, which in writing the book, I found very, very difficult to actually capture. And that's actually modal split. So I found a lot of cities give cordon counts, busyness on major routes, which is great, and it gives you a sense of how cycling is improving over the years and obviously getting better and so on. But unless you're actually measuring modal split across your city, and we can debate what the city actually is it just downtown? Probably not. But across the city, what we really need to know is how many people are cycling versus using cars, public transport, and walking. And that is for the short journey, just to the school, just to your local shops, as well as that longer commute into the city center. And unless we have that overall metric, we really can't see overall what is the role of cycling in your city. I think a lot of cities can get a little bit into a very strange debate again about it's all along the riverfront and I see lots of bikes and lots of free-floating bikes. And it's all going well. But if 95% or 99% of travel in your city is still by car, everything along the river is not going to change and create a sustainable city. And I think that's a difficult and expensive measure for many cities. And some cities do it very well. London, Freiburg, Copenhagen, the Netherlands, and so on. But particularly across the global world, and some of the issues I found in North America particularly, cities need to come up with a modal split. And Thomas, I think you wanted to add more.
I do, and I think this concept of modal split gets even more complicated when you consider that users don't just choose one mode of transport for their entire journey. I think perfect example in continental Europe and the UK as well would be someone takes their folding bike from their house to a tube or train station, right? A metro station or a train station, or even a bus in some instances. Gets on the bus for some part of their journey or the mode of public transport, and then goes on a bike again. I think that one of the challenges actually from that perspective as well is that they will cross at least 2, if not 3 jurisdictions. And they will be counted in different pieces of data from different jurisdictions, be it councils or city authorities, as using a different mode. So for the first one, cycling, right? If they live in one jurisdiction, they'll cycle to the bus stop. And for the second jurisdiction, they're using the bus. And for the third one, they're cycling again. When in reality, that person doesn't see it like that. They use a combination of modes to create a coherent journey. In that case, looking at total journey and modal split amongst a single journey, although challenging, will give you a more realistic view of how people are actually, as I said, using and engaging with the city.
Absolutely. And this is an enormous topic we could talk on. So I'm going to, we had another question we were going to talk about, which was understanding broader micromobility. And I'll just briefly make a comment and then we'll go on to the fourth question. Cities, don't forget micromobility, the emerging micromobility, e-scooters, but not just the shared e-scooters. There are lots of private e-scooters, skateboards, powered e-skateboards, trikes, lots and lots of kinds of devices, and they all have a role in building a sustainable city. It isn't just the classic bicycles. But again, what I found in writing the book is so many cities do not measure emerging micromobility. It just hasn't got into the list of things they need to capture. And that is a gap. Cities need to start thinking about how they're measuring the shared free-floating micromobility as part of the overall data set, but also these other types of micromobility, from the unusual to the usual, and again, across the city, not just in the showcase along the river by the major park. Raphael, did you want to add something?
Just one last thing, which is connected to what you and Thomas had said, and it connects to I think the latter part of our conversation. In very few instances are trips monomodal. I think usually car-based trips are usually monomodal, but even that includes a bit of you walking to your car and then walking from wherever you park the car to your end destination. But with a bicycle, I think the complexity here that we have to look at is typically, let's look at transportation planning and urban planning has been very focused on what are the splits of these modes individually, but haven't really taken into consideration that almost all trips are multimodal to a certain extent. And it's determining what part of the replaceable segments should we focus on as policymakers to improve, let's say, the livability of cities and improve safety in traffic for everyone, not just the motorists. So I think that's an important element, and it connects then to the last element, which we'll likely touch upon, is how can we leverage new technology to better understand the complexity of modern mobility, because it's, as you say, the legislation hasn't evolved as quickly as the modes of transportation and people's behavior. Even though we are creatures of habit, we will sometimes, maybe a quarter of the time, spontaneously change our favorite mode of transportation because we have more information about that. And how do we track that? And how do we make sure that we're taking all of those bits and pieces of information and analyzing that and transforming that into policy that allows everyone to have let's say, a safer but also a greener mobility environment around this. So it's, how do we leverage new technologies to tease out the complexity of mobility today, and each one of these movements, which is per se a multimodal, which means it's complex, and we have to fall back. We have to take 2 steps back and try to steer away from the fallacy of simplification. Oh, he's a cyclist, or he's a pedestrian, he's a motorist. Actually, in many instances, that specific person could be all those 3 things in one journey, depending on how they choose to get to their automobile, for instance, with a folding bike, etc.
And going on to the last question, we're going to talk about new technology. So Raphael, what is the role of new technologies in actually filling this data gap from your perspective?
I think there's a lot of potential for us to better understand the complexity of multimodal movement. So, to take Thomas's example, where one person will move from between 3 different jurisdictions, and they will participate as a transportation participant in 3 different modes in those 3 things, is bringing all of that together. So having elements of data between councils, where you see commuters that are going across borders. That means that we're able to leverage either open data sources to track people's movements. We're also able to use Google Maps and their APIs to determine more or less how people mostly are moving between point A and point B. There's also the possibility of using CCTV camera analysis to determine what mode of transportation is being used, and we can do that in a way which is still respecting GDPR, so we're able to track a person's movements within a city for a certain amount of time and determine, okay, he or she was cycling and then walked or then took a bus. So I think the challenge for policymakers is there's a lot of potential open data out there. There's also a lot of data that needs to be captured to refine their modeling, to better understand policies, and also about policy making, because that's also a thing that we think we've touched a bit upon, is policymaking is always a bit of an experiment. You run a hypothesis, you test to see what the results are, but you need to have data captured to be able to say, oh, I'm confirming my hypotheses, or I'm negating my hypotheses. So I think the use of tracking technology, the use of CCTV, and also using a lot of the computational capability that we have today, and generating new models based off of that will always help. The question is, do the cities and policymakers have the tools to use all of these, and also the budgets? And I think that's also one of the challenges that they're confronted with, is are we fighting a fight that we don't have the resources to fight today? Which I believe they do, but it's a matter of choosing the right priorities. I think we're the key priorities for them.
And Thomas, do we have the technology, or what technologies can assist us? Good question.
I read a magazine on transport policy. I'm not a tech guy by any extent. I think we do have the technology. I think there's an aspect of, I think we have the technology available. I think some of it is behind paywalls, some of it is proprietary, some of it's not open access. And there's also the social dimension, which Raphael talked about. How do we track people without infringing on their personal liberties? And how do we make data-driven decisions without losing other things that we consider important in life, right? Social, individual liberty, the ability to live freely within the city and not be followed by the state. I think it can be a bit extreme, but I think these are genuine concerns that citizens have. I think while citizens will appreciate a data-driven urban policy, they also will appreciate above all privacy. And that is an inherent challenge, be it in bikes, be it in cars, be it in others. I guess the advantage of the car and public transport is that either in the private vehicle, there's no anonymous, with the exception of your license plate, which means that it's perhaps easier to track it. And in public transport, perhaps there's less, there's a willingness to give up some aspects of liberty, which isn't inherent to the bicycle. I think this technology does exist, but as Raphael said, do we do it in a socially acceptable way? And do councils, cities, and authorities at every single level of government, they have the resources and the political will to put all that data together to create sound policy? I don't know, and I think that's an inherent challenge that will stay for a very long time, for which I have no answers for.
No, absolutely. And I would say again that the key issue for most cities, and actually to grow the cycling agenda, and obviously to make the case for more investment, more resources, more taking cycling seriously within cities, goes back to personal cycling. And there isn't an easy answer, because public transport has tickets, cars have license plates and licensing. The simplicity of cycling is its brilliance, but we need to know how many people are using their personal bikes in cities. And whether that's some kind of open data, the apps clearly will help, but that is not all of the cycling. Dialogue with your city and your city residents about how we can find, everyone in the city, including the cyclists and policymakers, can find out more accurately how many people are using the bike is critical to really understand the role of cycling in cities all over the world. I know, Thomas, you've raised a question, but to draw things to the end, I'm just going to say, I'll go back across the panel on final thoughts, and you can add in your extra comment as well. From my point of view, modal split across your city, robust data that allows you to put cycling and micromobility into the broader context of what's going on in your city. It must include walking as well. We didn't really get into the walking issue, but walking is, again, often the largest or second largest mode in many cities across the world. But we need the robust data across the city, including cycling, and that needs to be captured on an ongoing basis to provide insight to policymakers within the city, but then cross-comparison across cities to see how you're doing in cities around the world. So final thoughts, and Thomas, your extra comment.
I think from my perspective, a lot of it has been discussed. I think the last thing I would say is that provided the inherent difficulty in tracking cycling and micromobility, cities and authorities should actually engage with the public and offer them incentives to be tracked in an anonymous manner. I think people are more happy than some people within the cities would think to participate in such a schemes, especially if there's an incentive. Perhaps a bike is provided for free or at a reduced cost, and it contains some tracking tools. I think this type of data, using actual user data with their consent, can lead to perhaps imperfect data, because there will be a bias, right? The people who engage in such programs might not inherently represent the general population. That being said, engaging with it probably increases social cohesion from the perspective of engagement with the city authorities and with the population. It also enables city authorities to obtain some data which they might not have otherwise been able to obtain. So I would really encourage cities and authorities to engage with their citizens, take risks, but also bring people on as volunteers, which will probably help with sound planning.
Excellent. And Raphael, your final thoughts.
I think one summary of what we discussed is the simplicity of cycling is both its greatest weakness and its greatest strength when it comes to policy making based on data, simply because, as you both alluded to, most cycling takes place on personal bicycles that are currently not trackable. That is slowly changing with the advent of e-bikes, and they are becoming, let's say, more sensorized and more connected. But that still will never come close to the billions of bicycles that are out there today, even if sales, for instance, in Europe of e-bikes are now outnumbering normal bicycles. But to go back to sort of the last thoughts, as you said, Giles, I think the first thing is for cities, most cities out there don't have enough data or data of decent quality to make good, let's say, policy decisions, or at least try an experiment. So their first step is, how do we come up with at least the basic data around the modal split, and then think about the more complicated things about how do you track multimodal trips across a city, and how do you see how infrastructure design and policy design affects that, because there are data sources that use, for instance, mobile phone technology to determine whether someone is on an e-bike or a normal bicycle or walking or taking a tram versus a bus, etc. So I think first is get some sort of data together and try to extract the conclusions from that, but also determine what are the weaknesses in your data set. So what conclusions are a bit too far from your data set to be taken and then to be explored, and then try to augment that and correct those and mitigate those over the course of time. So you need a foundational layer of good data, start increasing it and augmenting it by bringing in more contextual data, finer data of what we would call in the world of coding metadata, so that you're able then to determine experiments in different parts of cities. Because I think also cities are quite heterogeneous, and very different parts of a city will also have very different mobility patterns associated to them. So the same policy will likely not have the same end result, nor have the same kind of impact in different parts of the city. So it's also taking into consideration socioeconomic factors. So getting the basic data in order first, and then understanding what are the external factors that might challenge someone to take up a bicycle as their main means of transportation. Or at least as a part of their transportation chain. Yeah.
Thank you. And again, there's lots to talk about. We've only scratched the surface. Actually, we're talking to the speakers beforehand. We're trying to kind of hold back, otherwise we'd be here for many hours. So I'll pass to Thomas to conclude the webinar.
Well, thank you, Giles and Raphael, for not only those insights, but that really enjoyable conversation. As Giles mentioned, we could talk about this for hours. But I think to conclude it, in today's modern world, it's absolutely evident that data is a core component of coherent and evidence-based urban planning and broader transport policy, be it with micromobility, be it with automobiles, be it with public transport. Evidently, more needs to be done to ensure that micromobility data, including cycling data, is sound. And it's even more important that the decisions based on that data are even sounder, if I may. And that's, as I think we've alluded to, is a challenge, but not an impossible challenge per se. As mentioned earlier, though, however, this discussion is part of a wider project in a forthcoming book called Can Cycling and Micromobility Deliver a Sustainable City?, published by the Green Mobility magazine and authored by Giles. If you've enjoyed this conversation, I would sincerely invite you to support the project through our crowdfunding campaign. Your contribution will help us bring the book to print here in Europe and also aid us in producing this series of short and accessible discussions that connect policy, technology, practice, and the public. You can find all the details and a link to the campaign on our website and in the description below. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.